A number of right-wing populist leaders in Europe have recently been aligning themselves with Vladimir Putin, despite his actions in Ukraine. But instead of losing support, political figureheads like Viktor Orban in Hungary and Marine Le Pen in France have increased their popularity, with Orban easily clinching re-election earlier this month. To explain how the war in Ukraine is bolstering populism around Europe is Dr. Gerhard Schnyder, Director of the Institute of International Management at Loughborough University, London. Hello, Gerhard. Welcome.
Hi, Pete. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. You're very welcome. Can you start off by telling us a little bit about yourself and what you do, what your area of research is, please?
Yes. So my name is Gerhard Schnyder. I'm the director of the Institute for International Management here at Loughborough University, London. I'm a political scientist by background, but then increasingly got into management studies, political economy, and that sort of things. And in that context, I worked on the impact of populism on multinational corporations, initially in Hungary, collaboration with my colleague, Dori Chalet, who is at the LSE. And we got funding through the North Face governance project, or program, I should say, for a project called PopBack, Populist Backlash and Democratic Backsliding in the European Union. And so it's in the context of that project, which involves 8 partner universities across Europe and the US, that we study sort of the impact of populism on various aspects of Western European societies and Central European societies and economies as well.
We're recording for quite a general audience, and so I said I would ask you some simple questions. So we'll start with the simplest. Could you explain what populism is?
No, I'm afraid not. It's a very contested and complicated concept in a sense. I mean, people don't agree what populism is and what isn't, you know. So that's where the problem starts in a sense,
okay.
Right? No, but I'm sort of semi-joking, but it really is not as clear as one would think, that easy to explain. But I would say, so sort of very common definition is that it is, that's where the disagreement starts. Is it a political strategy? Has it any content, or is it just a rhetorical device or a narrative in a sense? One of the key aspects that that characterizes populism is this opposition between the people, the pure, you know, and virtuous people versus the elites, the, you know, corrupt elites, the unpatriotic elites. That's sort of core to any populist discourse or movement or political group in a sense. And so in a sense, we start with this basic definition, I think. So the us versus them in terms of the people versus the elites. And then it comes with all sorts of, you know, refinements in terms of, you know, what exactly comes off from this basic opposition between people versus the elites. It's almost like a liberation movement of, you know, giving power back to the people, get rid of the corrupt elites for the benefit of the country and so forth.
Where are its roots? Where they originate from?
So it's got a very, very long history. I mean, so some scholars call populism the shadow of democracy. So ever since we've had democracy, we've had populism. So all the way back to Athens and you know, the antique democracies.
Yeah, because I mean, the term, you say it goes all the way back to ancient Greece, but the term's only really become popular coming to the public forum in recent years, hasn't it?
It depends a bit on which countries and which periods you look at. In Latin America, there's a long tradition of populism, you know, in the 20th century, right? I mean, before it became, you're right, obviously in Europe and the US, it became, you know, a phenomenon again in the 21st century, perhaps maybe late 20th century, but Latin America has had populist movements throughout the 20th. It also, I mean, you know, the progressive movement in the US in the late 19th century also was a populist movement that to some extent was called that. So there are, you know, it's sporadically, you know, crops up sort of in history. And in a sense, that's why it's the shadow of democracy, right? And that's why some people think populism is healthy, or at least inevitable in terms of it's a corrective to representative democracy. It's not new, but it's come back big time in recent years. Yeah.
Where's it found most? Where would you find? I mean, you mentioned Hungary, Holland, Italy. Where would you?
Yes, it's a bit everywhere, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, Switzerland has had one of the most successful populist parties since the 1980s. Actually, became the biggest party in parliament by the early 21st century. It's also very prominent, in Greece, also in Spain, where it's more left-wing populism. Italy, to some extent, is also more, left-wing populism than right-wing populism. Yeah, you mentioned the Netherlands. I would say the UK is currently being ruled by populists.
Yeah, and also going back to something you said before, you have all these splinters which have the basic, very sort of, like, as you say, basic tenets of the movement, but like you've just mentioned, you have right wing, you have left wing. How many different within Europe? How many different types are there, and where do you see them?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So I think it's, depending on how closely you look, you could probably find as many types of populisms as there are countries, in the sense that all of them have some sort of idiosyncratic aspect that makes them different from others, obviously, adapted to the context in which they emerge. And so Cas Mode, who is one of the experts on populism, political scientist, he calls it a donut ideology, meaning it's got a hole in the center. So it's got, this core of us versus them, people versus the elite, and you fill it with whatever you want, right? So it's a very flexible concept that can take all sorts of shapes, which also make it obviously difficult to then pin down what is and what isn't populism.
Like a malleable franchise. So you just like you say, fill it with whatever you need, I suppose.
That's right. Yeah.
Can you give me an example of some of the things that it's achieved in recent past?
It's brought back a discussion about democracy, that we hadn't had. So 1991, end of Soviet Union, and end of history, as some people called it, right? So the victory of liberal democracy as the uncontested best system whereby people live, and that was the ideology of the 1990s, right? There was no question that there's no alternative to liberal democracy and capitalism. Populism has thrown that belief completely, in this array, and it's it's once again highlighted that there's something not quite right with many of the Western societies, and that people are actually not happy with what has emerged since the 1990s. So that's, to some extent, that's a merit of populism, right? I mean, you could also say populism is just a symptom of that sentiment of discontent, as it were.
How has the war in Ukraine aided some of the populist politics in Europe?
I think fundamentally, the war in Ukraine is first and foremost a big challenge for populists in Europe, right? Because, siding with Putin against domestic governments for populists in opposition has always been sort of a media stunt that they like to pull, in a sense, right? You remember Salvini wearing a Putin T-shirt on the Red Square in Moscow. You remember perhaps Marine Le Pen in France having a picture taken during the 2017 election campaign, shaking hands with Putin. It's always had this factor of provocation, but also showing we stand for something different. We reject this softy liberal globalist approach of Western Europe that our governments adopt, and we stand for what Orban called a liberal democracy model that's more traditional, more religiously informed, and so forth. So obviously now with the war, that proximity to Putin, and many of them, Marine Le Pen said, she admired Putin as a great patriot, and Orban has met Putin 12 times in his 12 years in government, and so every year he goes to Moscow and shakes hands with Putin. Right. That became a problem initially, right? And quite frankly, I expected it to, to force these populists to take the distances from Putin. Yeah. But in actual fact, that's not what has happened now. Hungary had an election, and Orban was re-elected with, again, a 2/3 majority against many expectations, because for the first time the opposition was united, 6 parties choosing one candidate, backing one candidate, and there was some hope that Orban would, hope from the opposition that Orban would lose the election, but he won again with 2/3 majority. And that's quite astonishing in the current context, right? Because again, especially if you compare it to Poland, where the Polish populist government, takes a very anti-Putin stance, right, and is very solidaristic with Ukraine, and so in Hungary, the proximity to Putin hasn't harmed Orban's electoral campaign, and the same is true for France, where you can see that Marine Le Pen is, polling very well. She may actually, if you ask me to put money on any of the 2 candidates, Macron or Le Pen, my money would be on Le Pen.
Okay.
So, but to me, that's a puzzle, to explain, why did this proximity to Putin not hurt them?
And how is that? You mentioned Hungary and Poland. How has that that difference in opinion of Putin affected the pair of them, affected those 2 countries?
So it has affected them in very important ways, in the sense that Hungary and Poland have always had each other's back, right? Especially in the EU, at the EU level. So whenever the Commission or the Parliament wanted to do something against democratic backsliding in Poland, Hungary would back Poland in vetoing any measures and so forth. And that's now completely, again, is being completely put in question, with Orban being literally the only European leader currently in government openly backing, or at least not distancing himself from Putin as much. He criticizes Zelensky. He is clearly remained pro-Russian, right? And that has driven a wedge between the 2 countries, and it means that Orban is currently completely isolated in that respect in the EU.
Well, what sort? Can you explain the public support that right-wing populism has in the West? Then, what are the underlying reasons for it?
Yeah, so if you ask me about right-wing populist support in general, it's a huge debate, right? There's essentially 2 theses. One is the cultural backlash thesis, and the other one is sort of the more socioeconomic explanation. So the cultural backlash thesis really is there's a certain group of people in society who are uncomfortable with the way, our cultural values are going towards more pluralism, towards more, all the gender fluidity debate.
There's a lot of rhetoric around that as well, and political rhetoric, isn't there?
That's right, absolutely. And so people who buy into this thesis, see populism essentially as a question of ideas, right? A battle of ideas, war on woke in this country, right? Boris Johnson, Nadine Dorries, and so forth. Whereas the socioeconomic explanation, looks more at where does the discontent come from that leads people to reject the establishment, the current, even going as far as rejecting democracy itself. And these are studies, more in sort of economics and political economy that look at, what are the socioeconomic characteristics that make people vote for populists. And, one of the things we've learned in this country, Brexit was very massively backed by people in the so-called red wall seats, right, in formerly industrialized countries. There are studies that show, what determines vote for populist parties are things like experience with unemployment, so, economic uncertainty, declining living standards, and so forth. In my view, it's probably a bit of both, right? Or rather, socioeconomic factors make people open to certain ideas, right? Uncertainty makes people open. So that's the fundamental reason why people vote for populists, in my view.
Okay. And what are the implications for democracy as a result of this growing support?
So that's an excellent question. That's the $1 million question, right? So again, as I've got quite a few colleagues and friends, who are, self-define as left-wing, but, do not want to condemn people who vote for, Rassemblement National in France, or, Vlaams Blok, or whatever these populists are called, saying, well, this is a legitimate expression of democratic opinions, they have a reason to vote the way they do, and we should, welcome that as an expression of opinion. And that's precisely where I think the war in Ukraine sends off some alarm bells, in my view, in the sense that, take Orban. Since 2014, he has argued that, what he wants is a liberal democracy, right? So he's not anti-democratic, according to his own, statements, but he wants a different form of democracy. And obviously, you can argue whether, liberal democracy based on values such as pluralism and, free press and so forth is or is not the ideal system. He suggests we can have a different form of democracy where, the values we live by are more conservative, traditional family values, the women have children and stay at home, and that sort of things, right? Now, I'm increasingly doubtful that that's where this, democratic backsliding stops. I mean, it's one thing to move from one sort of democracy to another sort, but Putin has shown since he came to power that the movement may go beyond illiberal democracy to outright autocracy, right? Which
Absolutely.
is what Russia is now. And so I think there is a cautionary tale in all this, right? That, it's quite striking to see that what Orban did, is essentially, 5 years behind what Putin did, step by step, taking control of the media and so forth. You really have to wonder, does it stop or, at illiberal democracy, or does it go further, right?
Is that a logical progression then for populism? Is that I wouldn't say inevitable, but is that a way that it could possibly go all the time?
I think there's a distinct possibility that, perhaps democracy without liberalism, it does not work, right? I don't know. So our project is only in its first year. We've got 3 years on the project, and perhaps in 2 years' time, I'll have a firmer answer to you. But that's one of the questions we're asking, right? What's the link between liberalism and democracy, right? Are other forms of democracy, such as, sort of the plebiscitarian democracy, where, it's the opinion of 51% of population that counts and the minorities are disregarded, that's a form of democracy, but it's certainly not liberal, right? Because liberalism is based on individual rights and so forth. So to answer your question, sorry if I'm
no, that's fine.
Too much, but to answer your question about, is it a logical progression? I think to some extent, illiberal democracy, once you dismantle the barriers to majoritarian rule and to the power of, the constitutional limits to governmental power, then of course nothing prevents those in power to move all the way to autocracy, right? And hence it's maybe not, they may not choose to do that.
Yeah.
But the sort of person who wants as much power as an Orban, as a Putin, they tend to be the sort of person who want an autocracy, right?
Yeah.
Hence, maybe there is an inevitability in this change.
Okay. Right. Okay. Thank you very much. I think we'll leave it there. That was really clear, and you helped me understand it. So you must have done a good job. Thank you very much, Gerhard. It's been great having you on.
No worries at all. Thank you for having me.
Brilliant. Thank you for listening or watching if you're on YouTube. This show is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all other platforms. I hope you join us again.